80 million Americans just woke up under a heat advisory that stretches from Dallas to the Dakotas, and the forecasters tracking it are calling it the strongest heat dome currently active anywhere on the planet. Not the strongest in the country, not the strongest this month. The strongest on Earth, right now, sitting over the central United States. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. This is not the first heat dome of the summer. It is not even the second. This is the third one in roughly a month, and unlike the two before it, this one is not expected to break down before August even arrives. Stay with me, because the reason meteorologists are alarmed has less to do with the number on the thermometer and more to do with what happens when a body, a power grid, and a landscape never get a single night to recover. To understand why this dome is different, you have to understand what it actually is. Meteorologists are calling it an omega block, named for the Greek letter it resembles when traced on a weather map. A ridge of high is a lid clamped down and staying there. Underneath that lid, air is sinking, and sinking air compresses as it descends, which makes it warmer through simple physics, no extra heat required. That sinking air also crushes any chance of cloud cover or rain, which means the sun hits the ground without interruption, day after day. And that is the mechanism setting up temperatures past 110 degrees from the Dakotas down through Texas in the coming days. With heat index values, what the air actually feels like once humidity is factored in, climbing into the 105 to 115 degree range across a huge swath of the central and southern country. But the daytime number is not what should worry you most. Watch the nights. In the areas underneath this dome, overnight lows are not forecast to fall far enough to give anyone real relief. That matters more than people realize. The human body sheds the heat it accumulated during the day while you sleep, bringing your core temperature back down before the next day starts over. When the night stays warm, that recovery simply does not happen, and the heat load from one day carries straight into the next. Do that for one night, and most healthy people are fine. Do it for a week, and the elderly, the isolated, and anyone without reliable air conditioning start to fall behind in a race their bodies cannot win. This dome is not arriving into a calm summer. It is landing on top of two others that already rewrote the record books. The first hit the eastern United States in late June and held through the 4th of July, and it was lethal. Atlantic City tied its all-time temperature record at 106 degrees on Independence Day itself. Thunderstorms breaking. Off the edge of that dome knocked out power to roughly 250,000 customers in New Jersey alone, and Independence Day events in Washington and Philadelphia were scaled back or canceled outright. At least 44 people died in that first event, 29 of them in New Jersey, a 15-year record for heat deaths in that state. Then came the second dome in mid-July, and it turned toward the northern Rockies and Plains with an intensity that stunned local forecasters. Billings, Montana, hit 111 degrees, shattering a previous all-time record of 108. Miles City, Montana, reached 115, obliterating a record that had stood at 111. And Salt Lake City touched 109 degrees, its hottest reading in more than a century and a half of recorded weather history. Added up, and the picture becomes staggering. Since late June, roughly 280 million Americans, more than 80 million people tucked into pockets of coastal California and far west Texas, have seen anything cooler than normal. The National Centers for Environmental Information already has the country logged for its second hottest first half of any year on record. And now, a third dome is stacking directly on top of that, before the toll from the first two has even been fully counted. This is the part that separates an ordinary hot spell from what forecasters are describing as a genuine public health emergency in slow motion. A single heat dome is dangerous, 3 of them back to back, each one landing on ground already baked dry and bodies already worn. Down by the last one is something else entirely. And the engine driving all 3 has a name that goes far beyond this summer. It traces back to the Arctic, where the atmosphere is warming nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. And that is where this story turns from a weather event into something scientists have been warning about for years. That is where the danger begins. That story starts with the jet stream, the fast river of air high above the surface that normally steers weather systems from west to east across the country in a matter of days. The jet stream is powered by temperature contrast, the sharp difference between the cold Arctic and the warmer mid-latitudes below it. But the Arctic is not staying cold the way it used to. It is warming at nearly 4 times the global average rate, a process scientists call Arctic amplification. As that temperature gap narrows, the jet stream loses speed and starts to wobble instead of flowing in a straight line. A slower, wavier jet stream is far more prone to getting stuck, locking a ridge of high pressure in place for days or even weeks, instead of letting it slide through in a normal 48 to 72-hour cycle. That is precisely the mechanism behind an omega block. One peer-reviewed study from 2022 estimated that human-caused climate change has already made heat dome events roughly 150 times more likely than they were in the pre-industrial. ERA. This is not a freak accident of the atmosphere. It is the atmosphere behaving exactly the way the physics predicted it would. So follow the pattern forward, because the geography of this dome is not static. The core of the most extreme heat is currently centered over a corridor running from the Dakotas down through Texas, and several of those states are already carrying serious drought on top of the heat. The National Weather Service's Weather Prediction Center has widespread major heat risk mapped across much of the central and southern United States right now, with isolated pockets of extreme risk, the highest category the agency uses, stretching from the Rockies and Plains into the upper Midwest and Gulf Coast. Forecasters expect the worst of the heat to concentrate over Texas and the Gulf Coast by the middle of this week before the dome potentially reorganizes and spreads again. Denver is bracing for what meteorologists are calling a potentially historic stretch, with several days forecast above 100 degrees, compounded by wildfire smoke drifting in from northern Colorado that is already degrading air quality along the Front Range. That is where the danger begins to multiply, because this dome is not just cooking the air, it is stress testing the infrastructure underneath it, and the first crack already showed up on the grid. During the very first heat dome back on July the 2nd, the regional grid operator serving 67 million people across 13 states saw demand climb to roughly 162 gigawatts, the second highest load in that grid's nearly 100-year operating history, just short of the all-time record. Wholesale electricity prices in Newissita, in the corridor that hosts the world's largest concentration of data centers, spiked past $2,500 per megawatt hour, more than 60 times a normal rate. Federal energy officials had to issue emergency orders allowing power plants to exceed standard pollution limits just to keep the lights on. And it was not the first time this year that authority had been invoked for that same grid. Now look south, because Texas just ran its own version of that stress test in real time. Last Tuesday, the operator managing 90% of the Texas grid logged an unofficial demand peak near 87,000 megawatts. The very next day, Wednesday, it broke that number again, reaching roughly 91,300 megawatts, decisively surpassing a record that had stood since August of 2023. To its credit, the Texas grid held with more than 20 gigawatts of buffer in reserve, and no emergency conservation call was issued, helped in part by a solar and battery storage build-out that has roughly doubled since the last time the state faced a summer like this. But the pattern underneath both grids is the same. Air conditioning demand from tens of millions of homes is colliding with a baseline electricity load that keeps climbing year over year, driven in large part by the explosive growth of data centers. And every heat dome pushes that collision a little closer to the edge. And the grid is not the only system absorbing the strain. The ground itself is drying out underneath this heat. More than 3.3 million acres have already burned across the United States so far this year, a total well above the seasonal average, concentrated heavily in the west. In Colorado, the Aspen Acres fire has consumed roughly 101,000 acres since late June, making it the 8th largest wildfire in that state's recorded history, and it is still only partially contained. The Climate Prediction Center is now warning that rapid onset drought is developing across parts of the plains and the Midwest's Corn Belt, precisely the region this dome is centered over. That matters far beyond this week's forecast. When soil moisture disappears, incoming sunlight has nothing to evaporate. So instead of cooling the ground the way moist soil normally would, that energy converts directly into more heat in the air above it. The drier the ground gets, the stronger the dome becomes, and the stronger the dome becomes, the drier the ground gets behind it. It is a loop that feeds itself, and right now it is running in exactly the direction that keeps this system locked in place through the end of the month. That self-reinforcing loop is exactly why forecasters keep circling back to one grim statistic. Extreme heat already kills more Americans in an average year than hurricanes and tornadoes combined, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The agency recorded 2,294 heat-related deaths in 2024, the second highest annual total since systematic tracking began, just behind the record of 2,415 set the year before that. Since 2020, the cumulative heat death toll in the United States has passed 9,136, and health officials will tell you that figure almost certainly understates the real number, because heat deaths are routinely miscoded on death certificates as cardiovascular failure, kidney failure, or respiratory collapse, rather than what actually triggered them. This summer's ledger is already tracking toward that same grim pattern. 44 confirmed. Deaths came out of the very first dome, within the first 9 days of the season's heat events. Now a third dome is arriving before the body count from the first two has even been fully finalized, and that stacking effect is precisely what public health officials mean when they say this is becoming a compounding crisis, rather than the physics of why explain the danger better than any statistic can. A single scorching afternoon is uncomfortable, but the body has tools to handle it. The real threat builds when the nights stop cooperating. One warm night, most healthy adults absorb without lasting harm. 3 consecutive nights without real relief, and the body's ability to regulate its own temperature starts to erode. A full week without recovery can become fatal, even on a day when the daytime high never quite reaches triple digits, because it is not the peak temperature doing the damage. It is the accumulation. And that danger does not fall on everyone equally. The elderly, people living alone, anyone managing heart disease, kidney disease, or diabetes, outdoor workers, and young children carry the highest risk by a wide margin. A 5-minute wellness check on a neighbor who fits any of those categories during a stretch like this one is not a small gesture. It is the kind of thing that keeps someone out of an emergency room or worse. Now follow the pattern forward again, because this is where the forecast gets genuinely complicated, and honesty about that complexity matters more than false confidence. The core of the most intense heat is expected to sit over Texas and the Gulf Coast through the middle of this week, based on the latest guidance from the Weather Prediction Center. After that, confidence drops. There's a real possibility the ridge reorganizes and pushes the most extreme conditions back toward a different part of the country, the same restless behavior that has defined every heat dome this summer. What forecasters are far more confident about is the duration. Multiple outlooks now extend meaningful heat risk into the first week of August without a clear, decisive break in the pattern. That is the detail worth holding on to. This is not a system anyone expects to simply move through and leave in its wake. It is a system expected to linger, retool, and possibly rebuild rather than dissolve. There's also a legislative gap sitting quietly underneath all of this that most coverage of heat waves skips entirely. Right now, under federal law, extreme heat cannot trigger a formal disaster declaration the way a hurricane or a flood can. A bipartisan group of lawmakers introduced a bill that would add extreme heat to the list of disasters recognized under the Stafford Act, which would let FEMA respond to a heat emergency with the same resources it mobilizes for a storm. As of this week, it has not been enacted. That means that even as this dome pushes tens of millions of people into danger, the federal disaster response system built for hurricanes and floods has no equivalent lever to pull for heat. And communities managing cooling centers, wellness checks, and emergency room surges are largely doing it with local and state resources alone. It would be easy to treat this as an isolated American event, but the same pattern is visible on the other side of the planet right now. Europe endured its own record-breaking heat. In May and June, and as of this week, wildfires are actively burning across parts of Spain and France, with tens of thousands of people evacuated from the Madrid region alone. That is not a coincidence tucked into the news cycle. It is the same warming Arctic, the same weakened jet stream, and the same blocking pattern showing up on a different continent, which is exactly what the climate science behind this predicted would start happening more often. This is why the phrase you will hear from researchers is not that any single event is unprecedented. It is that the sequence, 3 domes in one country in the span of a month, echoed by parallel extremes overseas, is what a warming climate looked like when it stops being a projection on a graph and starts showing up on the thermometer outside your window. So where does this actually go from here? There are specific signposts worth watching over the coming days that will tell you which way this breaks, and they matter more than any single high temperature reading. Watch whether the Weather Prediction Center keeps its extreme risk category active into next week or lets it are already operating closer to their ceilings than at almost any point in their history. And watch the drought monitor, because if the Plains and Corn Belt rapid onset drought that the Climate Prediction Center flagged actually materializes, it feeds directly back into how long this dome is able to sustain itself. The straight red, without exaggeration and without false comfort, is this. The strongest heat dome currently active anywhere on the planet is sitting over the central United States. It is the 3rd one this country has endured in barely a month, and the forecast holds it in place with no clear exit before the calendar turns to August. That alone would be a serious story. What makes it something scientists are genuinely alarmed about is everything stacked underneath it. A power grid in Texas that just broke its all-time demand record twice in 2 days. A grid serving the mid-Atlantic that came within a hair of its own all-time peak. Weeks earlier and needed emergency federal orders to hold together. More than 3.3 million scorched acres in a major wildfire in Colorado still only partially contained. A drought monitor trending the wrong direction across exactly the corridor this dome is centered over. And a body counter from the first 2 domes of the summer that had not even finished being tallied before the 3rd one arrived on top of it. None of that means catastrophe is guaranteed. It is worth saying plainly that heat domes do break. Troughs dig in from other directions and shove them out. The jet stream can reassert itself. A dome that looks locked in place on a Tuesday forecast can look very different by the following weekend. And there is a real, honest chance this one weakens faster than the current guidance suggests. That possibility is not wishful thinking. It is a normal part of how these systems behave, and it deserves to be held alongside the warnings rather than buried under them. But the forecast, as it exists today, from the agencies whose entire job is to get this right, calls for persistence rather than relief. And persistence, more than any single number on a thermometer, is the variable that turns a heat wave from an uncomfortable week into the kind of event that shows up in mortality statistics months later. That is really the core lesson underneath everything you have just heard. It was never really about whether the temperature hits 110 or 115 this weekend. It is about duration, about what happens to a human body, a transformer, a stretch of drought-cured grassland, or an elderly resident on the fourth floor of a building without air conditioning when the reprieve that used to arrive every night simply stops coming. The three domes this country has lived through since late June are not three separate stories. They are one story, told in 3 acts, about what happens when the atmosphere loses the ability to reset itself between rounds. And the science explaining why that is happening more often, a warming Arctic, a slower and wavier jet stream, blocking patterns that used to be rare now becoming almost routine, is not speculation. It is the same physics researchers were describing decades before this particular summer arrived, playing out more or less exactly as predicted, if you are anywhere inside the corridor. This dome now covers, the guidance from public health officials has not changed, and it will not change, no matter how this pattern evolves in the coming days. Spend the hottest stretch of the day, generally from mid-morning through early evening, in air-conditioned space if you have any access to it at all, and if you do not, your local emergency management office or the 211 helpline can point you toward the nearest public cooling center. Drink water steadily throughout the day rather than waiting until you feel thirsty, because thirst is already a lagging signal that dehydration has started. Skip the alcohol and heavy caffeine during a stretch like this. Both accelerate fluid loss at exactly the wrong moment. If outdoor activity is unavoidable, push it to the earliest hours of the morning, before the sun has had time to build real intensity. And take the time this week to check on anyone in your life who is elderly, lives alone, manages a chronic illness, or simply does not have reliable air conditioning. And learn the difference between heat exhaustion, heavy sweating, weakness, cold or pale skin, nausea, and heat stroke, which is a genuine medical emergency marked by hot, dry, or moist skin, a rapid pulse, confusion, or loss of consciousness. If you see the second set of symptoms in yourself or anyone around you, that is not a situation to wait out. That is a 911 call. There is something almost deceptively simple sitting at the center of a story this large. A ridge of high pressure, invisible to the eye, holding still over a map for a few extra weeks longer than it used to. That is the entire mechanism. No storm, no explosion, no single dramatic moment anyone can point a camera at. Just heat, quietly accumulating, night after night, in bodies and buildings and power lines never designed to go this long without a break. That is precisely why it is so easy to underestimate and so difficult to warn people about in a way that actually lands. Hurricanes get names, evacuation orders, live footage of wind bending trees sideways. A heat dome gets a number on an app that most people glance at and forget by lunchtime. But the agencies tracking this one are not describing it in casual terms, and the numbers behind it, the grid, records, the drought maps, the mounting death toll from earlier this same summer are not casual either. So keep watching those 5 signposts in the days ahead. Whether the extreme risk zone holds or shrinks, whether the overnight lows finally start dropping, whether Texas and the Kikast mid-Atlantic grids keep setting records or finally find some slack, whether the drought monitor confirms what the Climate Prediction Center is already warning about, and whether August arrives with this dome still parked exactly where it is now. Because the answer to those 5 questions, more than any single afternoon high this week, is what will actually decide how this chapter of an unusually brutal summer ends. Watch the nights. That is where this story has been quietly writing itself all along, and that is where it will tell you, before the headlines do, which way it is about to break.